Alright guys, just want to share with you a really nice game. So here we go, game of the day. My opponent's rated about 1475. They have the white pieces and they're from China and they start with d4. Okay, so what I'm doing at the moment against d4 is I'm doing this Leningrad Dutch. So f5 signifies the Dutch and c4, very natural move, getting ready to put the knight behind the pawn. So I play knight f6, knight comes out, pawn to g6, now helps to protect the king. Bishop comes out now attacking the knight, but it's not pinned because there's still a pawn on e7. We haven't struck out with that. So bishop to g7, getting ready to castle, knight out and castles, and now the queen comes forward. So at this point you're thinking, okay, is white planning to castle queenside and go long? So I pushed e6. This is a very normal move in the Leningrad Dutch, at least, also in the classical Dutch, I think. So you're kind of preparing e5. So what this does is a couple of things: frees up the d7 square for this knight to come to, adding another defender to that square. Then you quite often put maybe the queen on e8 as well. Optionally also the rook. So white does indeed castle long. Okay, so now I play my bishop out to e6. Not very typical move, but I saw that this pawn was undefended, so let's have a stab. And white now plays a discovered defense. So this is a nice little move, and one that you should always consider and have in your back pocket, right? So pushing a pawn here adds a defender to, well, fourth defender to this pawn here, but also means that the bishop is defending that pawn as well. So now out comes the knight. So I'm just clearing the back rank and trying to exert more influence over the board. Adds another defender, yet another defender to that knight as well. So I've got quite a nice compact and coordinated position here. However, you have to say that white is the one with the space advantage, right? White has a piece inside my half of the board, has quite good control with these pawns, whereas I'm only really controlling a couple of squares on that side of the board as well. Okay, so now the king moves across. I think just finding some safety behind the pawns, really. And now queen e8, and we have a push on d5. So clearly there's only one place for the bishop to go, has to go back here. But my king is looking very secure in that little corner. He's got his whole posse behind him now. Okay, we have h3, maybe signaling some kind of intention to attack the tip of my pawn chain there. So I now push c6, and indeed g4 comes. So I'm still kind of eyeing up this corner of the board. It feels like white doesn't have much density of support around the king there. And obviously it's going to make a lot of sense for me to try and strike out here on the queen side, use my pawns, sacrifice my pawns, try and swap off, create some space, and use the fact that I've got my two bishops looking down towards white's king. Happy about that. Okay, so now I break with e6. So the idea is that if g takes, then I can recapture with the e pawn, and I've maintained my little structure here. White now captures the c pawn, which means that this guy is now hanging. I recapture and the queen grabs d6. But this is kind of okay for me. I'm not too upset about this. I'm figuring, you know, any pawns that we can remove on this side of the board is only going to help my cause, right? So knight comes out. This is another discovered attack. Gets out of the way of the queen. So now the queen is defending there. And we've got pretty good coverage on these squares around here, so I'm not too worried. Now the queen dives up to the f4 square. And this next move, I think, actually the engine said it didn't like it. It said I think it was a mistake. But I really like this move. Okay, so have a think maybe what you would play in this situation. I'll show you what I played. So the engine's recommendation was actually to play e5 straight away. And that would control all of these, and the queen would have to retreat to here. Okay, the move I played was knight to d7. Okay, so the idea here is that I've got now a discovered attack against this knight, and if I capture that knight and the b pawn recaptures, then white's going to end up with some, a real lack of security around the king. Okay, now the idea for white of lining up the queen and dark square bishop here is a very common one, which is to drop the bishop in here and eliminate my dark square bishop one way or another. Obviously, if I capture, I'm going to have a queen deep in my burrow, which I don't really want. So I probably wouldn't initiate the capture. But here, indeed, the bishop now moves down to h6, but I was ready for this, okay? I had ideas, maybe bishop to there, but that probably wouldn't work because we've got knight takes, and then queen takes. Then I'm looking at checkmate, so that's not good. But now e5. And here, white, I think, blunders. So, yeah, my pawns are covering all of this, okay? But white is, I think, too concerned with his own idea of looking after this bishop. I mean, clearly, if the queen now retreats, I grab the bishop for free, okay? So, white plays queen to g5, but can you see the problem with this? So here, I'm giving a little silent, or maybe not so silent cheer, because bishop to f6 actually traps the queen. Can't get there because of the pawn. Bishop's covering all of those. This pawn's covering that. The queen has absolutely nowhere to go. So, desperado time. Queen takes bishop, knight takes, bishop takes rook, king takes. Okay. Couple of reasons for this. I mean, the main one is simply my king was on a light square, right? Black's just lost their dark squared bishop. They've only got now a light squared bishop, so it's just a good all-round idea to have my most important pieces on the opposite coloured squares. It means that this bishop is then ghosted and can't check my king, for one thing, if it stays on dark squares. Okay, so now white captures a pawn, I recapture. Okay, so I'm up a queen for a rook, so it's like a major exchange. White also currently has one extra pawn, but I'm feeling pretty confident now. I just need to... we've only used 4 minutes. He's used 7 minutes nearly. Okay, so knight comes in, attacking my bishop. That pawn's defended by the knight. Bishop is defended by queen and king. So I'm not too concerned, but I move the bishop here anyway. It then plugs this hole, becomes a tall pawn, just shores up that structure, and also maybe prepares for a discovered check on white's king at some point. White brings their bishop onto the diagonal. Now I come in with my knight. Not sure of the specific purpose of that move, but I'm just generally bringing it closer to the king. King moves out of the way now, and now I decide to kick the knight. I realise that the knight's actually got very few squares to go to. I think it can only go back to f3. And now I decide to push e4. I saw that the knight could actually come here and maybe threaten my bishop, but I figure, look, I'm 4 points up in material now, okay? And yes, it's a bishop, but I've got pawns on light squares here, that pawn's on light square. My bishop maybe doesn't have too much scope, but the knight actually goes the other way here. Looks at this pawn, but it's defended by the queen. So now I pin the knight on the rook. I figure if I can trade off one pair of rooks, that's only going to reduce the risk level for me, okay? Well, h4 is pushed and I reply with h5. I don't want this pawn coming down, making a nuisance of it himself. So just shut that off. Now my bishop is just guarding the back of this inverted V, this V shape. Second attacker now on the pawn on f5. So I just get in the way. I interpose my knight. If the bishop wants to grab my knight, that's fine, but I'm also looking at this pawn with a three-way fork on both rooks and the bishop. So bishop actually exchanges itself off here. And I recapture with the f pawn. I just want to close things down, really. And I didn't want to recapture with the h pawn, which has a rook behind it. You know, I just want to keep things simple and keep control and make sure of the win. That's the important thing. Okay. Knight now comes round, pairing the knights together. Bishop f7. So now I'm deciding this pawn's kind of in my way. So now maybe a2 is the correct target. Knight comes in, and now I simply move my king. Okay, so what I'm figuring out here is, all right, white is on the back foot, but white is fighting for it. Okay, they're not going to give up without a fight. So I'm concerned that there's two knights that can jump into this square here with check and maybe a fork, right? So let's say, for example, knight comes in, I capture it with the bishop. Knight comes in again. I can't capture with the queen because that undefends this rook, right? So I'd be down the exchange in that case. So I just figure let's just remove the idea. There's no light square bishop anymore. So let's put the king on a square where neither knight can get to it. These knights are on dark squares, which means that whenever they move, they're going to go onto a light square, and that means they're just going to be looking at dark squares. So put the king on a light square, and we know that those knights can't touch the king in one jump. Okay, so now rook comes across looking at the knight. It is defended by the bishop, so that's not too bad. So I push a pawn and say, okay, you attack my knight, I attack your knight. Knight comes back to b3, and now I jump in with my queen. This knight is kind of pinned now because it's preventing queen takes b2 checkmate. So we have rook across, and I decide to swap off rooks. And now I just want to maneuver my knight. This square looks really nice. Again, it's looking at that b2 pawn. It's looking at this undefended pawn. It's looking at that knight. And I'm on a simplification drive at this point. Okay. Now I decide to swap off the knight, mess up their pawns, and I just want to simplify my way to victory now. Knight comes into d3, rook attacks, we trade off knights, and now it's just a relatively simple matter of trying to promote one of these pawns. And ideally as well, without, for example, getting my queen forked by a rook coming here. So I have to be, always be careful, always watch your back. And I'm quite proud of the way I did that in this game, okay? Rook now comes back up, because he can't come to here. So the reason I put my queen on there is I wanted to prevent the rook from having that check on c7. So I keep my queen on this diagonal, still defending that square, and now protecting this pawn. Rook comes across, I push my other pawn now, also protected by the queen, and now white plays king a3, and can you see the final move of the game? Queen a5 is actually checkmate, okay? King has no squares to go to, all covered by the queen, and it's game over. So I thought that was a really lovely one. It's always nice to be able to trap your opponent's queen. But I was quite proud of the way that I knuckled down and saw the job through, which is something that I know that I have had trouble with in the past. But this is a good example. So my chess is feeling pretty good today. So there you go. Very enjoyable game. Another introduction to playing the Leningrad Dutch against d4, if you fancy that. Give it a go. But otherwise, thank you for watching. Appreciate your support. Please subscribe to Chess Boot Camp if you haven't subscribed, and I will see you soon.